put that to one side. Brilliant. I think my dad is using a chainsaw outside, so this is fun. I think the chainsawing might have stopped. So this picks... Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome. If you are new here, my name is Grace, and today's video is going to be my February 2021 books video. So this is going to be a little overview of all the books that I read in the month of February. If you're only interested in hearing about one or a few of the books, then I'm going to leave timestamps in the description box so you can just skip ahead. So I had a bit of an interesting month in February. I knew I wasn't going to be able to read as many books as I did in January, purely because a couple of these are a lot longer than a lot of the books that I read in January, so I knew they were going to obviously take me a little while to get through. And a couple of these are a little bit more dense and heavy, both in subject matter and physically. So I wanted to really take my time with a couple of these and enjoy the books. So these are all of the books that I read this month. Very eclectic mix. If you saw on my Instagram, you've already probably had a bit of a sneak peek into these. So I'm going to get going in the order that I read these books in, and I actually did read kind of 2 books at once this month, which I don't always tend to do. It's never something I've really been into doing. Not that I find it super confusing to do that or anything, I'm somebody who likes to read one book and then move on to the next. But I actually did that this month with a couple of these, which I will explain why in greater detail as we go. So before I get going, I just want to say a quick disclaimer. If the lighting changes a lot during this video, then that is because my dad has now decided to start chainsawing some stuff in the garden. So I'm kind of gonna have to stop and start this video a few times, but we will make it work. The first book that I read this month was Jeff Vandermeer's Authority, which is the second book in the Southern Reach trilogy. I read Annihilation in January and I absolutely love it. If you are somebody who loves action, sci-fi, dystopian fiction, you will 100% like Authority, so I highly recommend that. And I did, because of that, have really high hopes for Authority. And while this didn't fall flat on its face, I definitely thought that it was a bit disappointing compared to Annihilation. It's not as pacey, but that's kind of a given when we think about the content that this is dealing with. So this picks... So this picks up pretty much where Annihilation leaves off, but we are faced with a completely different cast of characters, and the protagonist of Authority is a person called Control. So it's a man whose real name I think is only mentioned once or twice, and he essentially heads up the investigation into the last expedition. So what we are dealing with in Authority is a little bit more information surrounding Area X. So it's less of the action that takes place inside it, it's more of the information surrounding how people are chosen to go in there, what happens when data is retrieved from Area X, things like that. But I did still enjoy it and I would highly recommend this. I don't want to jump the gun and say I really like this whole trilogy or the Southern Reach series, but I can already tell I probably will. The final book in the series is called, sorry I'm looking at my shelf over there, it's called Acceptance, and I am very excited to read it. I will be reading Acceptance in March, so I will be able to give you a bit more of a full rounded overview into the Southern Reach trilogy once I have read that. But if you have read Annihilation and you couldn't get enough of Area X and the weird and wonderful world that surrounds it, then I would recommend this. The second book I read this month was the first pick for the book club that I have just joined, which is called the Breakfast Book Club, ran by the wonderful Emily. I'm going to leave all of the links to that book club's Facebook page and also her Instagram down below if you want to go and follow that. And today is the day where my dad's just loving life outside. I'm happy for him, but It's getting quite hilarious now listening to all this. So this was the first pick for the Breakfast Book Club. So it is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, and this was the first novel I have ever read by Colleen Hoover. It Ends With Us is a story about a young woman called Lily Bloom who finds herself in an abusive relationship with a guy called Ryle, and the book details their relationship from start to finish and her experience and emotional journey living through domestic abuse. So it goes without saying that this deals with a lot of tricky subjects, and obviously approach this with caution if you feel like you're going to have difficulty with some of those issues. I feel quite similarly talking about this book as I did about My Dark Vanessa in my January book video, and I think just because a novel deals with some rather tricky, intense, thought-provoking subject matters, it doesn't necessarily mean we get to just say, yep, it was fantastic, and not have anything critical to say about it at all. So, little disclaimer, same as my opinions on My Dark Vanessa, what I'm going to say about this novel are my opinions on the novel and not obviously the subject of domestic abuse. The first problem I really had with this book was how believable the characters were, in that they actually weren't very believable to me. The protagonist's name is Lily Bloom and she's a florist. To me, it would kind of be funny and cliche if that was really played up, but it felt serious. I know you're probably thinking, Grace, that is a silly reason not to like somebody's writing. For me, it just instantly makes me switch off. I found Ryle was again almost a caricature of himself. When we think of all of the tropes that surround domestic abusers, we think otherwise very charismatic, charming, successful people who then have this hidden dark side, which is exactly what Ryle is. He is a neurosurgeon. And then the other central character, who is Atlas, who is the guy in shining armour who comes along at the last moment and whisks Lily off her feet, sorry for spoilers, is also a little bit of an unbelievable character. So that was my first problem. I didn't feel the characters were believable, and in turn that made me feel a little bit more distant from their story. So I was unable to feel as emotionally drawn into this as if the characters had been a little bit more believable. The writing itself isn't bad, it's just not particularly gripping or noteworthy, I would say, and I think that some of this praise for the book is a bit confusing. Every person with a heartbeat should read this book, which is by Cami Garcia, that quote, and I really don't agree with that. I just thought it was a little bit like, yeah, take it or leave it. The characters I didn't find to be believable, the writing wasn't that great, the plot was very predictable, and I don't necessarily think it's provoking us to talk about domestic abuse in a different or a nuanced way. I think it is great and amazing that Colleen Hoover is writing about this subject. I'm not saying that we shouldn't write about it or that shouldn't be commended. I just don't think it's necessarily provoking a different kind of conversation or anything else. But that was just my experience with it. And I would be interested to know what you thought of this if you have read it. So that was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. I think the chainsawing might have stopped. Okay, so the next book that I read this month was one that I would put in the hefty book category, and that was Lanark by Alasdair Gray. This is I think it's nearly 600 pages, yep, 550 page book split into 4 parts, and the story follows 2 central characters. One of them is called Lanark and the other one is called Duncan Thor. Duncan Thor's story is rooted in realist Glasgow, whereas Lanark's story is rooted in a fictitious surrealist society called Unthank. The order of the books is all messed up as well. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think we start with book 4. Yes, so we start with book 3, we end with book 4, and in the middle are books 1 and 2. So books 1 and 2 are Duncan Thor, and books 3 and 4 are Lanark. So you have this really choppy narrative. The timelines in Glasgow kind of intertwine with the timelines in Unthank and vice versa, and so do the characters as well. It's a little bit of a mind-bending sort of story, and I don't usually go for surrealist stuff. I remember the first time I ever came across and read Kafka, which this is actually likened to, and I think at the end Alasdair Gray cites Kafka as one of his inspirations, and I can see that. I mean, I don't know whether you can even see from the illustrations as well, very Kafka-esque, very like ghoulish and scary and surrealist. And I really had, I'm literally coming out in goosebumps thinking about Kafka. I hated Kafka when I first came across him. Not as a person, as a writer, really not my style. And this is sort of reminiscent of that, but I found this a little bit more digestible, and I don't know whether that was because there was realism put in there with it as well. It deals with some very big issues: politics, poverty, sexism. It was a lot about individuality and perception of the self, and I have heard it compared to Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which I also see. It's I believe it's semi-autobiographical. I could just be making that up. If not, it is very tortured artist vibes. All of these things on the face of it are really not my kind of thing. I just don't like that. I find it a little bit self-indulgent at parts, and I had moments where I thought my experience of reading this was it felt like Gray was being a little bit self-indulgent with it, but looking back on it, I actually really like this, and I'm really glad that I've read it. This was one of the books that I read in with some other books because it's 550 pages. The typeface is tiny. It took me quite a long time to get through. It's very heavy because it's dealing with some of those things. It is a bit more meaty and takes a long time to get through. I found the surrealist portions of the novel actually more enjoyable to read, which again I find bizarre because it is not something that I usually go for. And I did on the whole feel pleasantly challenged by this book, and I would recommend it if that feels and sounds like your cup of tea. And I think this is probably very good for you if you perhaps have been used to reading this kind of thing, or reading stuff that challenges you a bit more and have sort of fallen off that bandwagon a little bit and want to get back into it. I would recommend this. But I would also recommend it for you if you have some kind of essay that you need a book to form an essay on, because there is loads in here. So I would recommend Lanark, but I understand it's probably not for everyone. I'm glad I read it. I won't be reading it again anytime soon. It was definitely, that was enough for me to read it once. But I did like it. It was good. So the next book that I started reading was a piece of non-fiction, and it is Chernobyl Prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. I really hope I pronounced that name right. I haven't actually finished reading this yet. I think I've got about 100 or so pages left to go, but this is a compilation of monologues taken from survivors of the Chernobyl nuclear explosion. So if you don't know, in 1986 there was a huge explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was reactor 4 that ended up exploding. It was one of the biggest nuclear disasters ever in human history. Reportedly, I don't want to do this a disservice, but I think it's less than 100 people were recorded as people who had died in the initial accident. However, obviously we know retrospectively hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives through the cleanup operation that surrounded the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. My motivation for reading this book was I was hooked on the HBO series of Chernobyl. I think I watched it all in about 2 sittings. I was incredibly moved by it and really felt like I needed to do more research into it. So I found the Chernobyl podcast, which if you've not listened to and you're a fan of the HBO series, I would highly recommend you do that. And in that podcast, Craig Mazin, who is the series producer, cites this as one of his sort of pieces of inspiration and information that he drew on in order to create the series. It is very obviously troubling, difficult to read in parts, but also very real. It's monologues from people who survived this, and I think it's a very interesting insight into something that we see as a science-based disaster, and allowing this human perspective on it, I think, is an incredible thing to have done. This won a Nobel Peace Prize, which I completely understand why it did. Like I said, I haven't finished this all yet. This was another one that I wanted to take my time with, and I think you should take your time reading things like this. It's real people telling real stories about an incredibly traumatic historical event. I'm very glad that I decided to read this, and if you have the bandwidth for it, then I would 100% recommend this. So in a complete change of pace, the next book that I read, I'm gonna say, was my favourite this month. It's Jane McDonald's autobiography. I love Jane McDonald. If you've not seen Cruising with Jane McDonald, then get it on your telly, because that is a breath of fresh air, let me tell you. I just love her. If you don't know who Jane McDonald is, she is a British singer, entertainer, performer who is absolutely fabulous. I love her to bits. She is from Wakefield. Well, her family, I actually found out through reading this, are from Scotland, but she moved to Wakefield in Yorkshire when she was really young, I think under 5 years old, and this is obviously the story of her life. I knew quite a lot of this already, being quite a big Jane McDonald fan, but it was very enjoyable to read it from her perspective. You can tell she's obviously, I'm pretty sure she's written it herself completely. I don't think she had a ghostwriter, but you can really hear her voice and her quirky little sayings throughout the whole book. It's just a nice light read. It's something that I've thought that I definitely needed. After Chernobyl Prayer and Lanark, I was like, I need something to just kind of take the intensity down a bit, so I turned to Jane and I was not disappointed. Obviously, if you don't like Jane McDonald, I mean, I don't know who you think you are if you don't like Jane McDonald, but if you don't like Jane McDonald, this probably isn't for you, but I loved it. I thought it was great. I'd read it again. Honestly, I'd read it again. The last book I have to talk about this month is Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, and unfortunately this is the book that I was most disappointed by this month. I am a huge Shakespeare fan. I adore Shakespeare. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on Shakespeare, which looking back on I probably could have done a better job of, but it is what it is, you know. But I adore Shakespeare. I love his work. I always have, and I thought because of that I was really going to enjoy this. This is a piece of historical fiction, which is where I think my problem with it starts. I've never really dabbled much in this genre before, and think this might have been not the greatest entry point. Hamnet is basically about Shakespeare's family or potential family, and namely his potential children who were twins. One of them is called Hamlet, and obviously one of Shakespeare's most famous plays is Hamlet. So this story is essentially a theory, or I think Maggie O'Farrell even describes it herself as a bit of a daydream into what potentially could have inspired the creation of Hamlet back in the day. So I had quite high hopes of this, but I actually didn't like it. I spent the last 30 or so pages just skimming through it. I found the description of everything a little bit laborious. I didn't find the plot particularly gripping. I'm not going to give too much away in telling you essentially the plot revolves around the plague, but even then it wasn't a very exciting, driven story about the plague. It was just sad. I didn't really like any of the characters in it. I would have liked to see more about Shakespeare because I love Shakespeare. I'm sort of thinking that historical fiction might not be entirely my bag, but I might have to read more to figure that out. So unfortunately it's a bit of a no from me on the Hamnet front. I wouldn't recommend this. If I had to pick one book for you to read this month, it would be Lanark. And if you feel like that sounds too intense for me, Jane McDonald. Just go with Jane McDonald. She's absolutely fabulous. So thank you for watching my February book video, guys. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you at the end of March, more likely the beginning of April, to talk about all the books I read that month. So until next time, bye!